Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Freedom Papers. My name's Morgan Zegers. I'm a contributor with Turning Point USA, and we're here with Arizona student Matthew from Grand Canyon University. Today we're going to get all in depth on Federalist paper number 10, pretty much the most famous Federalist essay in history.
Frankly,
Are you
it's
pretty
my
excited?
favorite. It is my favorite Federalist paper.
I can't pick a favorite. I'm like me. I have the rainbow as my favorite color, so it's only natural that I also can't pick
I remember
a favorite.
I was in high school and I asked this guy in the bathroom. It was at a political thing, and I'm like, "What's your favorite Federalist paper?" You know,
Casual dinner talk. It's fine.
51, he told me.
All right. Okay. So that's another good one, another more famous one. So the Federalist paper number 10 is all about how the Union is a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection. Ooh, spicy word these days. So it's also known as literally the most famous essay in the Federalist itself. What's so important about this is that it says when we're divided and we're a bunch of little Confederate states that all operate on our own, we just aren't as strong, and that makes us weak, and it makes people more susceptible to oppression. And so it's important for all of us to come together. Right now, one of my best evaluations of this that I've seen is that the Union is useful not just for survival, but for liberty and for the protection of minority rights against an oppressively powerful faction or majority. And so the framework of the proposed expanded representative government safeguards society from the natural tendencies of mankind.
You're right about that. You know, Benjamin Franklin said that describing democracy, if there's two sheep and if there's two wolves and one sheep and they decide what's for lunch, then the minority loses every time. So there has to be a framework where the minority has some privilege of saying what they believe in, where they're not undermined and franchised every chance they have to vote.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I mean, I talked about this in the first episode of Freedom Papers, and it's just this very basic concept that, okay, humans kind of suck sometimes. And by that, I mean pretty much all the time. All of history has been a case of one group of people, one person, one source of power oppressing a smaller group of people.
Yeah.
And when we consider that and understand how can we create a government by, of, and for the people that is going to protect people's rights, we have to consider the fact that human nature leads to oppression of other people. And how can we make those safeguards? And so that's what Federalist paper number 10 really breaks down. First quote, and this is one of the more famous quotes from the paper. Let's just get right into it. It says, "A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and concerning many other points, as well as speculation as a practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence or power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good." And so, long story short, putting it in more simple words, Morgan style, it's that people will always oppress each other and harm each other if they aren't cooperating and if there isn't a reason for them to cooperate.
There's always an opposite to a positive.
Yeah.
You know, and even since like one of the first stories in the Bible, in Cain and Abel, there was conflict there. And you know, God, I believe in this, that our Heavenly Father created things. It is or it isn't. You know, ones and zeros, black and white. And that has transcribed itself throughout history. We've seen conflict where there's two opposing opinions about any topic. And we see it here in the Federalist Papers. There's the Anti-Federalists and there were the Federalists. Today we have the Republicans and the Democrats. We have truth or lies. You know, these ideas are innate in our human nature and our human history, and they just reappear themselves in different forms. And that's what we're seeing here in Federalist 10 is what happens when there's factions. When there is liberty, factions will arise. And James Madison talks about that. He said, I have it written down here, liberty is to fire just like air is to, liberty is to faction just as air is to fire. As in, when you have liberty, factions and opinions and ideas are going to formulate. And there's nothing you could do about it and he talks about this, and we could talk about it a little bit more, how crazy and what the liberals are doing trying to do today, but remove freedoms. And he talks about the way that you remove factions is by removing freedom itself. And that is frankly not American at all.
No. When we look at all of this, really we're evaluating the problem that's addressed in number 10 and then the solution that's proposed.
Yes.
And the solution's quite smart. And so I want to break down that process for everybody so that we understand how we got to this concept of balance of power and of limiting the power of people without taking away their liberty. So the problem really is that when people are free, and this is not exactly a problem, but when people are free, we get to choose what the heck we want to do.
Amen.
You know, like we get to choose our lifestyle, our job. When we have economic freedom, we're choosing our career and how we earn our money.
Yes.
And that can lead to different trades. It leads to different businesses. It leads to different lifestyles and passions and beliefs on how society should function.
Yes.
And so when you have these differing views and different lifestyles, you're going to have people split off into their own groups. And so that's really the problem that is really a blessing turned into
really
a problem.
is a blessing.
When we are free people, we become different, and diversity is a beautiful thing.
It is a beautiful thing. And
I mean, especially
idea,
mental diversity and you know, intellectual diversity, which the left just doesn't like to address these days.
No.
But that's because they're totalitarian, and that's a whole other topic. When we have intellectual diversity, lifestyle diversity, which is really the beauty of the melting pot that is America, it's going to lead to differences. And so how do we, and this was the question posed to the people writing the Constitution and the people if they wanted to ratify the Constitution, how do we make a society, a system of government that encourages cooperation between these different factions that are living free and doing their own thing, instead of taking away their liberty and saying, you might hurt someone someday, so you don't get to do any of this.
You might offend someone. You know, that's what we're seeing
we're going to
today.
take away all of your freedom just because potentially you might be terrible one day.
Speech, you know.
So it's creating that protection for people. But that idea, if you think about it, throughout history, I love the weird stories of history. Like, remember the story of the like ancient Greeks and Romans and the Spartans and all those guys, the one of the Paris who stole Helen from Sparta and then a whole war started.
No, actually, can you describe that?
Yeah, so I really can't remember it very much, but basically this one guy back thousands of years ago took the wife of a fellow royal member of a different area, and they fell in love, and he took her, and you know, legend has it that an entire war was started over this because the guy who had his wife stolen went to his brother who was a king and said, will you help me get my wife back? And then it turned into a 10-year-long war. And so if you look, you can Google some of the craziest reasons why people have fought wars, why people have died. And Publius addresses this in Federalist number 10.
Yes.
And he says that people have gone to war and brought in violence and damage and chaos to communities and societies over some very serious things, but also some, quote, frivolous and fanciful distinctions.
Yes.
And so protecting people against that is really the core goal here. And when we had those confederacies, when we had these little tiny states, there's such a risk of each of them finding problems with each other and going to little mini wars against each other and battles and arguments that it can all be solved if we just came together as a union but kept those individual freedoms as states as well.
You know, it's also interesting seeing why these conflicts are coming out of play. And there's a term called Machiavellism, and in The Prince, Machiavelli wrote about how if you want to take over a country and have your power be present there, you got to present an issue and also be the solution to that issue too. And that's what we're seeing today. These Democrats are causing issues in the United States. And then they're also saying, oh, well, we have the solutions. And those solutions are usually, liberal and demonstrous socialism ideas. And that is Machiavellism. And the reason why I tie it back to these factions is because there's always two ideas for a solution. And there is a good intention for a solution, but there's also a malicious way. And I mean, I'm a conservative. I believe that our ways are for the people and for the liberty and freedoms. However, there are Democrats who are in it for the personal gain. Yeah. And we've definitely seen that with this current administration. We've seen awful ideas that have been presented, and the system that goes with it too, and the followers of this administration are in it not for the common good of our people. No. It is for their selfish demise.
Yeah, and selfishness is definitely a problem. And I should say too, the worries that Publius has and warns the people about, it wasn't as if he was just saying, you know, maybe one day we're going to start arguing, we're going to have problems. No, there was Shays' Rebellion.
Yes.
There was arguments between the states as they were, the little mini 13 of them. And in number 10, he addresses the problems that the Articles of Confederation had kind of caused. And so I just want to go through some of those, because then we'll get into the actual solutions and what's going on modern day style, because number 10 is under attack. So Publius cites the issue of, quote, prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights across the country. Complaints are everywhere that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. He said, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And that's, I mean, we see that today. What's happening with Black Lives Matter and Antifa, they are a small minority in many senses. They're very small, but they have massive media power and celebrity power and all this stuff behind them, but they are not paying attention to or caring for the rights of other citizens. And so where does that check come in? That's that frustration that I have with our politicians and with our current system. What the heck is the check on these people that are going out and jumping on the cars? I don't know if you remember this. There's a mother at a stoplight. Do you remember this? It happened after the George Floyd protests initially last year in 2020. She calls 911 because the protesters are doing one of those intersection stops.
Oh, yeah.
And I am so worried that I'm going to be one of those people, because, like, I can still carry, I'm going to make things happen, I'm going to protect my family, but I don't want to be put in that situation. And so people are coming up to her, they're smashing the windows all around her, she has her children in the back seat, and she calls 911 and she says, help, I'm feeling really unsafe, I don't know what to do. And the 911 operator says, I'm sorry, ma'am, you're going to have to call your local government. This is a sanctioned protest. I can't do anything. So then the 911 call has the woman going, no, they're on my car now. They're on my car now. And the 911 operator is saying, I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't do anything about it. So that moment was such a serious moment for so many Americans. I think so many mothers and parents that don't really do politics, that really opened their eyes to the fact that, okay, I thought I had certain protections in this system, in our government, in our society, and apparently sometimes when you call for help, nobody's coming, especially when these radical minority groups are starting to cause chaos and they have no care for our rights and our ability to be dignified human beings and just live our lives. So it's so interesting to me, and figuring out how we can balance that and protect people's rights while also giving Black Lives Matter and Antifa the right to do what they would like to do and voice their opinions and community activism and all that stuff is really the test that Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and the rest of the guys that were in favor of the Constitution were working to achieve.
And they were also in favor of republicanism and having a republic. I mean, I think a lot of students, and it's kind of embarrassing saying this, but they believe that America is a democracy. And it's not.
Even the Washington Post?
Even the Washington Post, you know, and it's not a democracy. It is a representative republic. And our founding fathers realized that there's going to be pressing issues. There's going to be motivated people who are going to rise up and start little factions. And in order to corral, what I mean by corral is not necessarily halt, because the founding fathers realized if we stop that, it's not going to work. But what we can do is to tier, or at least funnel these organizations or these movements to a productive role. And that's why they created the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is supposed to be a place that represents the nation, and it's also as we know, that they're in for 2 years. They have to rerun every 2 years. And our founding fathers realized that if we do that, that will keep the factions in check. That it will comply to public interest at that time, and then it'll morph to whatever the public interest is in 2 years. But they also realize that's a little too radical. We also need to have something that's a little bit more centralized and tamed, and that's why the founding fathers also implemented the Senate. As a field to be a little bit more grounded, you know, and it's an analogy I think about a lot, especially when it comes to factions, as the United States as a ship. And if we steer the ship too sharply, the ship is going to fall over. It's going to capsize. But if it's slow and methodical and and pointed, we're going to see movement. We're going to see the ship go out in a right direction and not capsize. And that was. There's a lot of solutions that they thought about, but this is one great solution that they comprise of dividing the House or the legislative branch of the U.S. government.
Yeah, I mean, and you started to touch on the solutions of it. I love Madison's breakdown. So Madison wrote number 10 under Publius, but I still can't get over the name. So he writes it, and he addresses the two potential ways that you can control a faction. The first option, you can destroy the liberty of that faction. You could say, you're done. We're going to cut you off at the knees. You're done here.
And I don't know how you can do that. I mean.
Right. And so he was like, that's one option. But then that completely goes against the entire goal that we have here as we write the Constitution and as we build this new government. Like they started America for a purpose. And it was to provide liberty to everybody and also provide protection so that nobody can really be oppressed here. And not only that, but because we did see many problems throughout the next coming centuries, we have a system where you can pass reform and legislation that will fix any of the problems that we face. And so many people will say capitalism sucks. Look at like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in the 1900s. And I'm like, you guys, immediately after that, legislation was passed to prevent this kind of behavior because people are always going to be bad. And so that is that protection from our system of government. That doesn't mean you need to scrap everything and try communism. But so back to this, Madison was like, okay, we can't destroy the faction's liberty just because they might cause some harm in the future. So what's the other option? You can eliminate factions by forcing everybody to be the same. You could just say, okay, no more diversity then, folks, because that leads to problems and that leads to factions in different groups. So we're all just going to have to think the same, be the same, do the same stuff, and agree on everything.
Like Communist China.
Yeah. So that's what I want to talk about with you is he saw this coming from an early stage. You can't do it.
No.
You cannot achieve it because under liberty, people are free to do whatever the heck they want. And if you tell them you have to be a certain way or think a certain way, you are removing their liberty. What are some things that remind you of this? I immediately, I don't want to be the same person to be like, Orwellian. Because everybody these days is like, it's 1984 all over again. So I don't want to make any more 1984 references because it is a book, but we did actually see it with things like the Cultural Revolution in China. And we see it in a lot of situations when the left rises to power. They try to eliminate any wrongthink, any political opposition, any cultural differences that could lead to diversification of the population. And with the Cultural Revolution in China, they got rid of 4 olds. I don't know if you knew this, but Mao Zedong, the chairman. Let's just do a quick recap, you guys. Okay, the China we deal with today is the China that had all of the problems happening and the millions of people dying just a handful of decades ago in the last century. They're not separate, they're not different, they didn't have some big change. Let's be real here. The regime is the same regime from the Cultural Revolution and from every other atrocity committed by China just a handful of decades ago. Now that that's understood, let's understand the China of today, in its past, tried to eliminate the 4 olds. It was the old ideas, old culture, old habits, and old customs. That is exactly what Madison is talking about.
Those are the same principles in the Communist Manifesto. Is removing old customs and liquefying beautiful diversity into a one world order of a utopia. Their idea is a utopia where everybody's the same. You can't go out and work what you want to do. You can't. They control how many family members you have, where you work, how much your income is, what you eat. And that's a world I don't want to live in. And I think that's a world where many people don't want to live in unless you're communist. But even I spoke to many communist people who don't have that same idea. They're individuals. Heck, I've seen them at colleges across the state. And
communist people?
People who are saying that they're Maoists. I'm like, oh, it sounds like you believe in individuality.
I had a roommate with a poster of Mao Zedong, Lenin, Stalin, Karl Marx, and Fidel Castro on her wall. So I've been there and done that college experience, and I'm glad to be out. So everybody watch Frontlines with Isabel Brown. But when we look at like what China was trying to do, there's a really good book It's called The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand.
Uh-huh.
And usually I talk about this when the left is all like against family and children
Yes.
and monogamous relationships and stuff, because you see some crazy things coming out from the pop culture magazines, like telling women to do things that just will make them truly unhappy. And in The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, the antagonist is talking about how he takes control, how you take control of a group of people and in society. And he says, you empty that man's soul, you empty their souls, and once you've emptied a man's soul, the soul is yours to take. And so when you look at Cultural Revolution of China, ideas, culture, habits, customs, those all make up tradition and family and value and sources of fulfillment, some of the most natural sources of fulfillment. And when you strip people of those, they really don't have their own sense of identity, and they don't have something to stand for. You know what I mean? How people say, when I have a child, it changes my perception of life. It changes my intentions with everything that I do. It changes my whole outlook. And now everything I do is about this person. The left is removing that from our society by creating these like sad, childless people and telling them their kids are going to die of climate change, so don't even have them. They want people to just have no sources of fulfillment. Not only that, but they don't want them to have attachments that they would stand up and put their life on the line for and actually defend the society for, to protect their child's future, to protect the future that they would be in. And it's truly disgusting and sickening. We see that today, though, now with the cultural war in America, the culture wars, baby. What happened in Cultural Revolution of China was just disgusting. Like you had people dying in mass amounts because family members would basically report their own family members to Mao's army just to say, I saw them reading this book, I heard them complaining, I heard them, praising
what happens when
to the Lord.
Fear is enticed in someone's heart.
Yes.
The evil things happen. And when fear is presented in our country today, I'm hopeful this won't happen, but I'm afraid that we're going to see something like that, what we've seen in China, with this new administration, and how they use fear tactics to scare people and to control. It's all about control. And again, in Federalist 10, they talk about control too, of how there's an opposing opinion. How do you smother that? How do you get rid of that and submerge it? You remove their freedoms, and that's what we're seeing today.
Yeah,
we're
it's
removing
the removal
the freedom,
of choice.
Of choice and and liberty.
And when we remove people's ability to think for themselves,
Yes.
you are then making them this empty-souled person that can easily be more controlled. And we talk about this with Madison, of him saying people deserve the freedom to think differently and to live differently. And that's a beautiful thing. And so he says, not only can we just not destroy the liberty of a faction outright, but we also can't force them into a certain lifestyle, way of thought, or anything, because that's also removing their liberty. And today in America, with the culture wars that we have, I always tell people, stop calling it cancel culture, because it's not cancel culture. They are eliminating some of the most important aspects of our society, and they are ostracizing and removing people who dare to speak out against these things from the public square, from their positions of power. And I live in San Antonio right now, right above the Alamo, and I found out recently the Texas educators are trying, that are on the left, of course, not the right, the ones on the left are saying we've got to reteach the Alamo. We can't tell people and students anymore that these were heroes because they were white nationalist settlers on Mexican land. And so we can no longer celebrate the Alamo. If you go to Texas, everybody loves the Alamo, okay? So if you remove that big cultural aspect of society and of their history and their heritage, that's a big smack to the face. And so it's just one example. I saw something that, this is crazy. So they said something about how American pie, or apple pie, is racist. I read an entire article, I think it was like salon.com or something. And they decided to go after none other than American pie. So we've done like the statues, we've gone through the American history classrooms, we're taking
now
down.
They're attacking pie.
Next is Mount Rushmore, right? So now it's American pie is apparently racist too, because like the sugar is from Haiti that is on the crust of the American pie, of the apple pie. The apples are originally from Asia. It's just, it was insane. And so reading that, it just reminds me of that cultural revolution of taking away little aspects of our society that we can all agree to and love. But let's get back into it. So Madison says you can't take away people's freedom. You also can't take away their ability to be different, because that is removing their freedom. And so what is the solution? The conclusion is that you cannot remove the causes of faction problems. Like you can't remove what creates factions. You can't remove the causes. Instead, you have to control its effects. And so the Constitution, the goal of it became, okay, how do we control the effects, the negative effects of factions.
Yes. And that's what we see in the rest of the Constitution. I want to highlight Article 5. Article 5 is where we could amend the Constitution.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah, so
please tell that to everybody who wants to get rid of our document.
You could, and we've 17 amendments, or sorry, 17 additions to the Constitution. This is not including the Bill of Rights, in which Madison actually proposed and brought up. And he talked about how we need to, it's government's job, and this is in the Constitution, but it's government's job to recognize its powers and control its powers, but we also need to recognize that individuals have rights and they have freedoms, and we need to establish that in writing, and that's where the amendments come into play. And when the reason I bring that up is because when it comes to factions and ideas that are presented in government or in just in public view, you need a way to route that again and to control or at least funnel in, that motivation to somewhere, and that gives us the power to amend. We also have the power to sign petitions, or talk to people. We have the freedom of speech where we're able to have that conversation with someone. But ideally, Thomas Jefferson wrote that. That the people have the right to abolish the government or to at least change. And he wanted to have that somewhere in the Constitution. And that leads to Article 5, where we have the right as Americans to add our new customs. And our founding fathers realized that
it's not rigid. It's not rigid.
It's not rigid.
It's fixable.
It is fixable.
And
we
you touched on this a
adapt.
little bit earlier with that idea of republicanism
Yes.
versus a direct democracy, and that's that next step that Madison discusses of like the best way to control factions is to make sure that there aren't just a few, because if there's just a few of them and society's kind of small, it makes it a little easy to have that small faction grow
Yes.
and rise up and take over and oppress the people. And so he said one of the benefits of us being this union, of us being this expanding union, especially like not just this finite group of people, is that it protects us from these smaller groups of factions, because the more the merrier, you know what I mean? The more there are, then the more diverse the conversation's going to be, and the less likely somebody's going to be like falling for what one of these crazy factions is saying. They're going to just hear all these different conversations and it's going to be okay.
And I love that you said the diversity of ideas.
Right?
That
crazy
we
concept
should see
these
that
days.
more often, especially on our college campuses or just in general.
Right.
There should be a diversion of ideas.
Well, the quote that he gives is, "The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The more easily they will concert and execute their plans of oppression." And it makes sense. I mean, like, can you imagine, think of Portland, for example.
Yeah.
California. I specifically think of Chaz and Chop in Portland. Are you kidding me? Can you imagine if that was just one little country? They'd take over that dang country.
Yeah.
Do you know what it was like when Castro and Che Guevara landed in Cuba? They landed, they had their first battle against Batista, and they end up with numbers in the teens. The teens.
Wow.
That's a small amount of people. So what they did is they built these ranks up by just going from small town to small town and being like, hey, we're trying to make our way to Havana because we're going to have a revolution. And what they would do, this is like, it normalized the concept of forced wealth redistribution in the eyes of the people there. They would steal animals from the local landowners and the farmers, and they would bring them to the peasants in town, and they'd say, see these? We just stole them from the evil rich people down the road, and it's not fair that they have all that food. It's not fair they have all that land. It's not fair they have these animals. So we stole them, and we're giving them to you because you deserve them, and it's what's right.
Machiavellism.
It's what's right. And so then the people, of course, want to join into that, and so they build up their army as they make their way to Havana, and they have their revolution. They literally have a communist revolution in the small island country of Cuba. And that's what I think we would be seeing in a country like, or if Portland or one of those like blue states was its own country, they would easily be taken over. So I thought that was fascinating, and thinking of like how they stole those animals and normalized that concept of like forcibly taking what someone else has because that's what's right and moral and fair. When we think of today, I think of AOC or Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders standing on stage and saying, you see those evil wealthy people on Wall Street, those evil millionaires and billionaires? It's not fair they have all that money. It's not fair they have all that stuff. I'm going to take what they have and give it to you because you deserve it. That's what's fair. That's what's moral. Just give me power to do so. I remember when Elizabeth Warren, like during the 2016 election or whatever, she had on her website that you could put in an amount of student loans that you had, and then a calculator would go beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, and then it would spit out how much money you would get if she was in office and actually enacted the legislation. And so I was like, okay, 100 grand. I put it in, and it's like, boom, $50,000 is removed from your debt. Support Elizabeth Warren. And I was like, is this not wrong? Is this not weird that you're like buying someone by saying 50 grand? I mean, when I would talk to young girls in my office in my first job that I had, they did not care about politics or anything, but they were like, yeah, I feel hopeless with my student loan debt, and so I'm a Bernie bro. Like, I want to have my student loans canceled. That's how simple it was for them. And I know we're getting off topic right now, but it's that concept that a small group of people, like what we had with Chaz and Chop and George Floyd Memorial, I don't know if you knew that they also had an autonomous zone there that's like still going on.
No, I did not.
It's some crazy stuff. That is kind of, controlled in the sense because we do have that stronger union put together. They can't take over one state.
Yeah. Geez, I didn't hear about that.
Sorry, I just totally went on a rant, but they really get me going sometimes. It really bothers me the way they act like that.
And we can see what happens when there is passion in ideas. It could definitely inflate into something that's radical.
It could be bad passion.
It could be bad passion.
Bad passion.
Yes.
That's a nice way to put it.
But how, again,
evil.
and I love that you said this too, that there isn't multiple or large entities of passion. There's smaller enclaves or smaller groups of passion that could keep each other accountable in checks and balances. It's a really beautiful concept, and our founding fathers definitely thought about that too with states.
Yeah.
And Federalist 10 talks about state laboratories as well.
I'm glad you brought that up because I want to talk about that too.
Sorry, I don't know if you
go ahead.
No, state laboratories, and it's an awesome idea where states have the rights to decide, and this is with the 10th Amendment. States have the right to govern themselves, to implement laws that are better tailored to the people that are in their state. They may not be the right laws, like in California and Washington, but it's tailored to the people and what they want. And the idea is that, well, our founding fathers want to have a diversity of ideas and see what works and what doesn't work. And it's up to us as the voters to see and recognize, is this working in my state? Is this working in our country? And if not, how do we remove and amend or to eliminate that idea?
Yeah.
And it's also our right to make sure that idea doesn't grow exponentially, where it will destroy our country or to that state.
Cut it off, because that's what's happened. A few states have tried like healthcare for all, Medicare for all these things, and they've absolutely failed and completely bankrupt. And nobody really likes to talk about those kind of situations because they happened a decade ago, and so it's totally in the past, right? Let's try it again nationally. But it's nice for us to be able to see what works and doesn't work. What's our problem now, though, is especially with COVID, we saw the propaganda arm come in and smash Florida, Texas. They're doing great. They're killing it. And I hate to say that with COVID. Whoops. But they are really killing the game. And by that, I mean they're saving lives. They are protecting people. They are also preserving freedom in the utmost way. And of course, the lefty media, that is truly just propaganda for our national government, as Congressman Andy Biggs likes to say. They really didn't like that, and so they had to attack the governors that were doing a good job, even though the blue states were the ones failing.
How can they control us?
And so it all goes back to that idea of like, if we are not an enlightened public, we can't make the right decisions and rationally consent and uphold the Constitution. So if we don't actually know what's happening in these states, what's working and what's not, we're going to continue to consent to the crazy ideas of people like New York State and California and all these dictator-style states until we actually are enlightened about what's going on in states that chose freedom and protection for the most at-risk groups that could potentially actually die of COVID.
That you bring that up, especially
I'm fuming.
Especially with New York and California as the largest populations in the United States. And that goes back to Madison's idea of a republic. In a republic, it gives states, smaller states, just like Wisconsin, or just anything in the Midwest, frankly, the political power, or at least a voice for them to hear. If we didn't have a republic, states like California and New York will make every decision for our country, and their laboratories that are falling apart are going to control the country, and we can't have that happen.
Well, you saying that, so I'm from upstate New York. I don't know if you knew that. I went from New York to Texas, and now I'm just westing it. Western expansion. I'm Annie Oakley, and I'm just going all over the place. But I moved from from New York to Texas, and our problem in New York State is kind of the problem that the people that wrote the Constitution wanted to avoid at a federal level, where like just the coastal cities, the elites, they're controlling in these big states what happens all in the rural areas of the country. What's happening in New York State is there's the 5 boroughs, and they have millions of people, pretty much more people than are all in New York State combined. And so like if a conservative person wants to become governor in New York State, for example, they have to win 16% of the vote in New York City, and then all of the rest of New York State. And all of the rest of New York State is pretty much solid conservative.
I've seen
we
that.
are like Texas, but with mountains is how I describe it. Texas, but with a lot of really beautiful mountains. And so our struggle has always been that our lifestyle, our cost of living, our way of life is always infringed upon by these New York City liberals and leftists that have no idea what it's even like to own a vehicle.
Exactly, or own a farm.
They have no idea. And so I wish we had a better version in New York State in terms of our state constitution that would protect us and give us more of a voice, but we don't have it. And so I'm thankful for the Constitution doing that at the federal level.
Yes, and even breaking it down to a local level. I believe that local government should be stronger than state government. And I think state government should be stronger than national government. It's because government can't throw a blanket over all the people in the United States. They can't do that, and we've seen that happen, and it fails every time. The best way to recognize issues is on a local level, and even a neighborhood level. And I tell this to a lot of people, that especially students, is that the battle is not in Phoenix, the battle is not in Washington, the battle is in our neighborhoods, and that's the way that we're going to find out where our issues lie. And that's how we adapt and tailor ourselves to the exact circumstances of the people. If we don't know our people and what issues are there, or if New Yorkers are making, or people from the city are making decisions for people out in the rural areas of New York, it's not going to be well. And our founding fathers knew that is clear, because at this time there was a ruler. There was a different culture in the South compared to the aristocratic North. And they wanted to have a system that incorporates both ideas. Again, having those diverse ideas come together. And that is only through republicanism. And that is only through a republic government where there's representatives from each, we could even break it down to neighborhoods. But right now it's with just CDs, congressional districts, where they represent the people, and then they represent the people on a national scale. And
there's a cool story that's in number 10, kind of about like, there was an issue where people that were against republicanism and didn't want to always have to come from their territory to come meet, they were annoyed by that idea of having to come meet all the time and like go all this distance, especially the people out in the far states that were on the border. And the reply to that was like, you guys, you're the ones that are most at risk because you are so far away. So do you want to be a part of the protected club when somebody invades, or do you want to be out there on the outskirts, first one to get invaded, and then you aren't a part of our unit, our union, I should say, actually. And so that was just like a funny thing of like, you guys, are you really complaining about traveling to meet just so you could be a part of us because you don't want to travel when this is your true security on the line? So I love that, and we'll get more into that in like numbers 2 through 5, or more about the foreign affairs and everything. Well, let's get into just some more discussion points of it. So history is pretty ugly, and it proves that people will almost always end up oppressing each other. And I think it's really exceptional that America was able to come up with this beautiful mixture, this beautiful document that allowed us to be diverse, intellectual diversity, live our own lifestyles, and still do it. Do you have any favorite examples of like when throughout our American history we have come together. We've brought factions together, encouraging them to cooperate instead of dividing, and how that goodness has really spread even up to present day.
Yeah, so I would give the example a few weeks ago. I mean, it's unfortunate that we lost service members in Afghanistan, but I've been seeing on social media that Americans are coming together under crisis, and that is something that is present in all, just throughout history, is that when there's pressure and crisis, people come together because we need each other. And again, when it comes to the original 13 colonies, the reason they came together is because there was crisis. They needed to rely on each other's state for their protection. And it's just an efficient way of doing that. But that is one example I'm seeing right now, is where Americans are coming together. I love seeing that at football stadiums, at high schools, that they're leaving 13 flags on the stadium seats, or at bars, they're leaving 13 seats alone with a pitcher of beer. You know, I think that's a great way of seeing how America comes together under crisis. And that's just a recent example. Another recent example is the election of President Trump. I got to see a great amount of Americans, and unfortunately a lot of left didn't like that, but especially those who love America, you know, typically those who love America rally together. We were motivated, and there's nothing better than a Trump rally, like when it comes to motivation and spirit. It's so American. Yeah. But again, those are some examples I've seen where people come together under a common good, a common goal, and that is what ancient philosophers have been talking about as common virtue. Yeah. Civic virtue is coming together onto single goals, single motivations, and working on solutions on fixing that. Yeah. When America comes down and talks about how can we fix issues together, bipartisanship, is where I see the most unity in our country.
I do. One of my favorite examples of just the Constitution and our system of government encouraging cooperation between people instead of pitting them against each other and then having people argue all the time is just the fact that they gave them the freedom to have economic independence and to choose their own career field, to build industries on their own. And that cooperation between industries, between business people, between markets is such a great example that I think goes overlooked, because it's not technically the structure of the government and different governments working together. It is factions, though. Yes. And that's kind of the point, is that we don't just want different government bureaucrat factions and all these different interest groups working together. We want private entities to feel like they can coordinate and work together to achieve the public good. So I think that's really beautiful. All right, so last thing to kind of wrap up.
Okay.
Federalist number 10. It's, again, the most popular paper in the Federalist. We could talk about this for quite some time. But one of my favorite versions of introductions from Federalist Papers is by Charles Kessler. And he says, "The Federalist concern for veneration of the Constitution shows that a purely calculative or self-interested attachment to government is not sufficient to secure republicanism. The Constitution must attract the loyalty, admiration, pride, and even reverence of American citizens if the rule of law is to be firmly grounded, if republicanism is to be responsible. In the end, then, one needs an opinion of the Constitution's goodness to attract, define, and hold Americans' passions and interests in a decent republican order. This means a politics of public opinion, not just of fractured interests a la Federalist number 10. Majority faction, in other words, cannot finally be defeated except by a healthy majority opinion, the formation of which is Publius's chief educational and political goals. This implies not so much of politics of virtue as of responsibility, which is consistent with men's natural rights, Underwood in light of the honor of the human race." Wow. So that was a lot to unpack. But first of all, this idea that the Constitution must attract the loyalty, admiration, pride, and even reverence of American citizens if rule of law is to be firmly grounded. What I'm getting out of this is that it's not enough to just have control of the effects of the factions. And so number 10 might be amazing because it does talk about, okay, we will limit people's powers to make factions and oppress other people, but that's not enough to just sustain and continue the country. What we really need is for a majority of people to still have a basic understanding and education on these issues, or else they will get taken over. And that's exactly what's happening today. It's what in what he mentioned earlier, and we talked about this in episode 1, that idea of an enlightened public is needed to rationally and enduringly consent to the Constitution. Right now, we don't have that. And right now, we also, what he's saying here, we don't have that majority of people that is educated enough to continue these values. That's fascinating, actually.
It is.
Wow.
It is. And, you know, it stems from, I mean, simply just reading the Constitution. And not only just reading, but having conversations about that. I think these discussions here that we're having, or even debates with others, will invigorate the mind to think about the Constitution a little bit more, and to realize, why are these fundamental ideas in the Constitution? Why are these our rights? Where do our rights even come from? And those are the questions that many Americans are bypassing. They don't think about that. And that's why it's so easy to have those rights removed that we're seeing by large factions. And again, it's when it comes to Federalist 10, it's all about the safeguards and how to corral factions in America, and what happens if those factions are too large, and how dangerous it could be if they're too large, if they have bad intention, ill intention. But there's also, when there's smaller factions, it could also keep those smaller other factions in check. And that's what we see, like with special interest groups or TPUSA, Turning Point USA. We see these little. These are factions. They are. What they are is not necessarily large organizations. It could be just a Bible study group where people come together with the similar passions, similar ideas, and they talk about that and they enact on that. And when you have something that's in contrast, you can have those conversations. America is that stage where we can have those conversations, and to have those debates and relay our thoughts.
I think right now that it's disintegrating, though, because people make the case that, oh, public education, our school system, is intended to create this majority of educated people that know the basics, right? That know how to be a good citizen, that know the basics of government, that know the basics of society and science and math and all these things. And right now our public education system is failing.
It's failed at that.
And so I always challenge people to rethink education. First of all, stop making the assumption that just because you're sending your kid to public school, they're getting basic education and really important education on history, government, politics, and finance, business, all those more real world things. They probably aren't. The second step is, what is my public school teaching my child? Don't just send them off on the bus every day and then assume that they are learning what's needed. That's where that concept of local activism that we discussed in episode 1 really comes in as well, where we have to be more involved. And that means going to local school board meetings, monitoring curriculum, and especially paying attention at the state level where a lot of this curriculum stuff is done. The third thing, though, should my child be in government school? Because guess what? Public school is government school. And I'm a little biased on this. I can't wait to homeschool my babies one day, because I'm going to homestead it, you guys. I'm going to homestead it. I'm going to homeschool my babies, and I'm so excited. And I didn't think about it because there's these stigmas. Guess where those stigmas come from? The teachers' unions, the very powerful factions that are the most powerful political groups in the country with a serious amount of money. Also, the socialist parties in America, the groups there, they encourage their members to join the teachers' unions, not to oh, I want to be a teacher and I want to help kids and I care about children and students. No, it's literally because when you are a teacher, you're a member of the teachers union, and guess what that gives you? Access to the most powerful political group in the country. They want as many socialists and radical leftists in that group as possible. So when you see stigmas against charter schools, against other alternative schooling options, and specifically against homeschooling, it's because they are trying to legislatively make it as difficult as possible for you to get your kid out of government school. Don't listen to it, don't fall for it. So all of these different options are ways for you to just take more command of the education of your child, because this starts at the home. If we don't care about the way that our children are being brought up and the way our children are learning about these basic concepts, we will continue to see generation after generation of unaware students, unaware adults that then grow up and join the workforce and become all of these active people. But it's exactly what Kessler's talking about, where we need a majority faction that can attract the loyalty, admiration, pride, and even reverence of American citizens to the Constitution of the United States. It's required for us at this point. If we're going to fix the country, because right now we're on our knees, it's the only way for us to get out of this.
And it's so dangerous having Americans who are just just people be unaware. That's what we saw in this past election, is people who are unaware. They don't know what's going on, and when they don't know what's going on, it's easy to be controlled because you don't have your trust, or you don't know what's going on. It's frankly just easier to just be told and to listen.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing today in our schools. And
well, you're a student. Can you maybe
Yes.
we're going to close up in a couple minutes. So do you have one last message for you? I mean, you're going through school.
Yes.
All of the students out there that maybe want to take more control of what they're learning, I always like to tell people, if you're in school and you're mad that, the Federalist Papers are not in your curriculum, I'm sorry, you can go to Barnes & Noble and buy the Federalist Papers. You can read yourself. You can go and take control of your education. And so that's what I did. I didn't learn any of this stuff. I didn't become a political commentator or any of this crap because I got a major in college, a degree. It's because I started reading on my off time. So that's a whole other conversation. But what's your message to young people so that we can get this population that's ready to consent to the Constitution
Absolutely.
again?
I am a government student, and I had to read Federalist 10 on my own volition. And we haven't even talked about the Federalist Papers.
I'm like dying inside.
We are slowly getting into the Constitution, and it's a slow-paced, and it's sad seeing that. So my message to people who are not even just students in general, if you want to get active and know your country, you got to do this on your own volition, because in this world and in this country, things are not told to you. You gotta act up and shape up. And work
shape
for
up
yourself.
Self-reliance. Take control of your own life. Be self-reliant. Do not rely on this government to do anything for you. Educate yourself and your family, and really become the best. I say become the best and most educated person you could possibly be. All right, thank you guys for watching another episode of Freedom Papers with me, Morgan Zegers, Turning Point USA, my friend Matthew. Stay tuned for more episodes. We will see you next week, and we are going to continue to have really great guests that talk about these incredibly important documents about our nation's founding.